Somewhere in the archived records of Mississippi's antebellum history lies a case so unsettling that 3 different county clerks refused to transcribe the full testimonies. 9 plantation owners, all men of significant wealth and standing, found themselves subjected to the very practice they had inflicted upon hundreds of enslaved people: forced breeding, meticulously scheduled and clinically documented. The man who orchestrated this reversal was himself property on paper, a slave named Moses Jackson, whose intelligence and patience turned a system of brutality back upon its architects. What the historical record shows in deliberately obscured fragments is not a tale of supernatural vengeance, but something far more unsettling: a methodical campaign of psychological warfare waged by someone the law considered less than human. Before we continue with the story of Moses Jackson and the plantation owners who learned to fear their own practices, if you're new to this channel, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. We bring you the darkest corners of American history that textbooks won't touch. And please leave a comment telling us what state you're watching from. We love knowing where our audience discovers these forgotten stories. To understand how a man in chains could bring 9 masters to their knees, we must first understand the world that created Moses Jackson and the brutal efficiency of the system he would eventually turn against itself. The Yazoo Delta region of Mississippi in 1842 represented the pinnacle of what plantation owners called scientific agriculture, a cold euphemism for the systematic exploitation of human beings for maximum cotton production. Here, where the rich alluvial soil could make a man wealthy in a single growing season, 9 neighboring plantations formed an informal consortium. Their owners met monthly to discuss crop prices, pest control, and what they termed stock management, the buying, selling, and breeding of enslaved people. These 9 men, Silas Rutledge, Bartholomew Crenshaw, Josiah Pryor, Nathaniel Pendergast, Cyrus Whitfield, Augustus Fairchild, Cornelius Vance, Thaddeus Beaumont, and Edmund Halsey, controlled between them nearly 2,000 acres and over 400 enslaved people. They were not the stereotypical brutal overseers of popular imagination, but rather educated men who approached slavery as a business proposition, attending the same church, sitting on the same civic boards, their children attending the same private academy in Vicksburg. What made their consortium unusual, even among their peers, was the clinical nature of their breeding program. While forced breeding existed throughout the South, these 9 men approached it with an almost scientific rigor that shocked even other slaveholders. They kept detailed ledgers not just of births and deaths, but of bloodlines, physical characteristics, perceived intelligence, and what they called temperamental suitability. They loaned enslaved men and women to each other specifically for breeding purposes, treating human reproduction as one might approach the improvement of livestock. Into this world, in the spring of 1823, a woman named Esther was sold to Silas Rutledge's Willow Creek plantation. She was 23, literate, though she hid this dangerous knowledge, and 5 months pregnant. The child's father had been sold away months earlier, a common practice designed to prevent familial bonds that might inspire resistance. Esther gave birth to a boy in August of that year. Because Rutledge had recently acquired a valuable horse named Moses, he gave the child the same name, the way one might name 2 dogs from the same litter. Moses Jackson grew up understanding, with the clarity that comes from witnessing horror daily, the exact mechanisms of the system that owned him. He watched as his mother was loaned out to Crenshaw's plantation when he was 7, returning 3 months later with a haunted look that never quite left her eyes. He observed the quarterly meetings where the 9 owners would gather, usually at Rutledge's manor house, discussing their human property over brandy and cigars. And he learned, through careful observation and his mother's secret literacy lessons conducted by candlelight in their cabin, to read not just words, but human nature itself. By the time Moses was 16, his intelligence had become impossible to hide completely. Rutledge, rather than seeing this as a threat, saw an opportunity. Smart slaves, if properly controlled, could be valuable. They could serve as drivers, overseeing other enslaved people, managing complex tasks that freed white overseers for other duties. Moses was assigned to work in the plantation's record-keeping office, a small building near the main house where ledgers tracked every aspect of the operation. It was here, copying columns of figures and names into fresh ledgers, that Moses saw the full scope of the breeding program. The clinical language made it no less horrifying. Asterisk productive pairing, Sarah, 23, to Augustus, 27, anticipated yield in 9 months. Poor outcome, Julia, 19, miscarried, reassigned to field work. The 9 owners traded enslaved people like playing cards, arranging unions based on nothing but projected genetic outcomes and economic value. Moses said nothing. He kept his face carefully neutral, his handwriting neat, his demeanor utterly subservient. But behind his eyes, something cold and patient was taking shape. The incident that would eventually lead to the reversal began not with Moses, but with his mother. In March of 1841, Esther was assigned to what the ledgers called breeding rotation with a man from Beaumont's plantation. She was 38 by then, considered past prime breeding age, but the consortium was experimenting with what they termed extended productive years star. The man assigned to her, a field hand named Samuel, was barely 19. Esther refused. Refusal in this system was an impossibility the owners had not engineered into their calculations. The response was swift and public. Esther was whipped 30 lashes in the presence of all enslaved people on the Rutledge plantation, a demonstration of what happened when property forgot its place. Moses, now 18, was forced to watch. The overseers made sure of it, holding his head so he couldn't look away. Esther survived the whipping, but something fundamental broke. 3 weeks later, she walked into the Yazoo River and didn't come back. The official record listed it as an accidental drowning. Moses, copying the death notation into the ledger in his perfect script, said nothing. His face remained placid. His hand didn't shake. But when Rutledge glanced at him, checking for signs of grief that might interfere with work, something in Moses's eyes made the plantation owner uncomfortable enough to look away first. This should have been a warning. For months after his mother's death, Moses made a request that surprised everyone. He asked permission to marry. The woman was named Rachel, and she belonged to Cyrus Whitfield's plantation. She was 21, strong, intelligent in the careful way that enslaved women learn to mask. Moses had met her during one of the consortium's quarterly gatherings, where enslaved people from all 9 plantations would be assembled so the owners could evaluate potential breeding pairs. Rutledge, pleased that his educated slave was showing initiative in the very system he served, granted permission. It fit perfectly with the consortium's plans. A union between 2 intelligent, strong individuals could produce valuable children. Papers were drawn up. Rachel was temporarily transferred to Willow Creek. A small ceremony was allowed, the kind of wedding enslaved people were permitted, no legal standing, but enough ritual to satisfy their supposed need for civilized behavior. What none of the 9 owners realized was that they had just granted Moses Jackson access to every plantation in their consortium, because now he had a wife who could be, and regularly was, loaned out for breeding purposes to the other estates. And because Moses had made himself so valuable in record keeping, he was often sent to update ledgers at the other plantations, carrying correspondence between the owners, delivering breeding schedules and assignment changes. For 2 years, Moses played his role perfectly. He was the model of what these men wanted to believe about slavery, an intelligent Negro who recognized the natural order, who served efficiently, who asked for nothing but the small privileges of a trusted servant. He learned the layout of every plantation. He memorized every schedule, every routine, every security measure. He identified which overseers drank, which ones gambled, which ones could be bribed, which ones visited the slave quarters at night for purposes they wouldn't admit to their wives. And he learned something else: the owner's greatest vulnerability was their absolute confidence in the system's permanence. They had built a structure so complete, so total in its control, that they couldn't imagine it being turned against them. The reversal began on a humid July night in 1843, when Bartholomew Crenshaw disappeared from his own bedroom. His wife found the empty bed at dawn, the sheets undisturbed. A massive search was organized. Every slave on every plantation was accounted for and questioned. Moses, who had been working late on ledgers at Rutledge's office, was briefly interviewed and dismissed. He'd been seen by multiple people throughout the night. Crenshaw was found 3 days later, 15 miles away in an abandoned overseer's cabin on the edge of Vance's property. He was alive, unharmed physically, but profoundly shaken. His account, given in fragments to the local sheriff and his fellow consortium members, was nearly incomprehensible. He claimed to have been drugged, his evening brandy tasted slightly off. He remembered nothing until waking in the cabin, chained to a bed. What happened during those 3 days would only emerge later in pieces, when the other owners began to disappear. The disappearances followed a pattern that became clear only in retrospect. Each of the 9 owners vanished from his own home, always at night, always with the same careful efficiency. Josiah Pryor disappeared exactly 2 weeks after Crenshaw returned. Then Nathaniel Pendergast, then Cyrus Whitfield. The intervals were irregular enough to prevent prediction, but regular enough to create mounting terror. The local authorities were baffled. These were not common kidnappings. No ransom demands arrived. No political motives could be identified. Each man was found after 3 to 5 days. Always in abandoned structures on the edges of the consortium's properties, always chained, always physically unharmed, but psychologically devastated. And each man refused, initially, to speak about what had happened during their captivity. The consortium's quarterly meeting, scheduled for October 1843, took place under extraordinary circumstances. 5 of the 9 owners had now experienced the abduction. Armed guards patrolled the grounds of Rutledge's manor house where they gathered. The remaining 4 men, Rutledge, Augustus Fairchild, Cornelius Vance, and Thaddeus Beaumont, demanded to know what their colleagues had endured. It was Pryor who finally broke the silence, his hands shaking as he accepted a glass of whiskey. What he described sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. During his captivity, Pryor had been visited daily by a masked figure who never spoke, but who left documents, copies of the consortium's own breeding ledgers. But these copies had been annotated, transformed. Where the original ledgers listed enslaved people by name, age, and breeding potential, these new versions listed the 9 owners themselves, complete with false but clinical details. Josiah Pryor, 48, strong constitution, demonstrated fertility, 6 legitimate children, suitable for breeding program. Recommended pairing schedule, daily rotation with females from target demographic. Goal, 100 conceptions over 24-month period. The specificity was what made it nightmarish. Each owner's ledger entry included details about their own families, their own children, their own physical characteristics, all described in the same dehumanizing language they had used for 2 decades to discuss enslaved people. The documents were professionally prepared, copied in perfect script, the kind of script Moses Jackson was known for. But Moses couldn't be responsible. He had alibis for every disappearance, witnessed by multiple people. He'd been working in Rutledge's office during Crenshaw's abduction. He'd been at Beaumont's plantation, updating their quarterly records, when Pryor vanished. The investigations, such as they were, had cleared him immediately. After all, he was property. How could property orchestrate something this sophisticated? What the owners didn't yet understand was that Moses hadn't acted alone. He had spent 2 years building a network that the consortium's own structure made possible. The monthly breeding rotations, the loaning of enslaved people between plantations, the movement of servants and field hands for various tasks, all of this had allowed Moses to identify and carefully recruit others who shared his intelligence, his patience, and his hunger for something that transcended simple escape. There was Rachel, his wife, whose forced movements between plantations made her an invisible courier. There was Daniel, a blacksmith at Fairchild's plantation, who could forge chains and locks. There was Grace, a house servant at Vance's estate, who had access to laudanum from the medicine cabinet and knew which beverages each owner preferred. There was Isaac, a driver at Pendergast's plantation, who could move freely at night under the pretext of checking on livestock. There were a dozen others, each playing a small role, each with perfect alibis, each invisible in the way that enslaved people were always invisible to their owners, present but not seen, human but not acknowledged. The abductions continued. Edmund Halsey disappeared in November. The pattern was becoming clear, though no less stoppable. Each owner would vanish, experience whatever happened during those days of captivity, and return changed, quieter, more nervous, checking over their shoulders constantly. What the community whispered about, what the newspapers in Vicksburg reported with carefully worded ambiguity, was not just the disappearances themselves, but the strange behavior of the victims afterward. Bartholomew Crenshaw, once known for his enthusiastic participation in the breeding program, suddenly ordered it halted on his plantation. He wouldn't explain why. When pressed by the other consortium members, he would only say, "You'll understand when it's your turn." The phrase, "when it's your turn," began to haunt the remaining owners, because it was becoming clear that this wasn't random violence or even revenge in the conventional sense. This was systematic. This was personal. This was building toward something. In December of 1843, during what would be the consortium's final quarterly meeting, Augustus Fairchild made a desperate proposal. They should free all their slaves immediately, dissolve the consortium, and leave Mississippi entirely. The other owners stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. Silas Rutledge, who hadn't yet been taken, laughed outright. "We own over 400 people worth a collective fortune," Rutledge said. "You want us to just give them away because someone's playing pranks on us?" "These aren't pranks," Fairchild replied, his voice tight. "What they're doing to us during those days, it's the program. Our program. They're applying it to us." The room fell silent. Everyone present understood what he meant, but no one wanted to speak it aloud. Before anyone could respond, Moses Jackson entered. Carrying the updated ledgers from Fairchild's plantation, he moved with his characteristic quiet efficiency, placing the books on the table, nodding respectfully, beginning to leave. "Moses," Rutledge called out, stopping him. "You hear things, moving between plantations as you do. Any word about who might be behind these incidents?" Moses turned, his face carefully blank. "No, sir. Though I did hear something strange from one of Mr. Crenshaw's field hands." "What?" "He said Mr. Crenshaw has been having nightmares. Wakes up screaming about schedules and rotations." Moses paused, as if uncertain whether to continue. "Begging your pardon, sir, but that's the same language in the breeding ledgers, isn't it? Schedules and rotations." The room went very cold. Moses had said nothing inappropriate, nothing that could be called insolent. He'd simply made an observation, the kind of observation an intelligent servant might make. But something in the way he stood there, waiting for dismissal, made every man in that room profoundly uncomfortable. "Get out," Rutledge said quietly. Moses left, but the seed was planted. Because now they were all thinking about what Fairchild had hinted at, what Crenshaw's nightmare suggested. During those days of captivity, something was being done to these men, something that mirrored precisely the system they had created. The truth emerged in fragments over the following weeks, as more owners were taken and returned, as their resistance to speaking about their experiences gradually crumbled under the weight of shared trauma. What they finally admitted, first to each other, and then in carefully worded testimony that 3 county clerks refused to transcribe in full, to the authorities was this. During their captivity, each owner was subjected to a precise reversal of the breeding program. They were visited daily by enslaved women from their own plantations or their colleagues' estates, women they had assigned to breeding rotations over the years. These women didn't harm them. They didn't need to. They simply arrived on schedule, as per the meticulous plans outlined in the annotated ledgers. The owners were chained, yes, but they were fed well, kept clean, treated with clinical efficiency. And each day, they were presented with the same choice their enslaved people had faced for decades: comply with the breeding schedule, or face consequences. The consequences were never specified. They didn't need to be. The psychological weight of being utterly powerless, of being treated as nothing more than biological machinery for someone else's purposes, was its own unbearable punishment. No actual breeding occurred. The women who visited made that clear through subtle communication. This wasn't about producing children. This was about teaching a lesson in the most intimate, devastating way possible, by making these men feel, in their own bodies and minds, what it meant to be reduced to reproductive potential, to have their humanity stripped away and replaced with function. By February of 1844, 7 of the 9 owners had experienced the reversal. Only Silas Rutledge and Thaddeus Beaumont remained. The terror in the region had reached a fever pitch. The local sheriff, himself a small slaveholder, had no framework for understanding what was happening. This wasn't a slave rebellion in any conventional sense. No property had been damaged. No violence had occurred. No one had tried to escape. And yet, the social order was collapsing from within. The 7 men who had been taken were changed. Some had sold their slaves and moved away. Others had freed small numbers of enslaved people, not all, because that would mean financial ruin, but enough to feel like penance. Bartholomew Crenshaw had taken ill with what his doctor called nervous exhaustion and barely left his bedroom. Josiah Pryor had become a vocal advocate for gradual emancipation, a position that made him a pariah among his former peers. The consortium was dead. The breeding program was finished. But Moses Jackson's campaign wasn't over. Because 2 men remained who had orchestrated the system, its primary architect, Silas Rutledge, and his most enthusiastic supporter, Thaddeus Beaumont. Rutledge, to his credit, understood what was happening better than the others had. He recognized the systematic nature of the reversals, the careful planning required, the intelligence behind it all. And he began to suspect Moses, not because he had evidence, but because he had watched Moses for years, and finally understood what he'd been seeing, not obedience, but patience. On March 3, 1844, Rutledge called Moses to his study. It was evening, the house quiet, his wife visiting relatives in Natchez. Rutledge sat behind his mahogany desk, Moses standing before him as always, the posture of servant before master preserved even now. "I know it's you," Rutledge said quietly. Moses's face didn't change. "So? This whole business, the disappearances, the program. It's too perfect. Too precise. It takes someone who understands how we think, how we operate. Someone with access to our records, our schedules, our homes." Rutledge leaned forward. "It takes someone who could forge my handwriting well enough to create false documents. Someone exactly like you." "That's a serious accusation, sir," Moses replied, his voice level. "What evidence do you have?" "None. That's the brilliance of it. You've built everything on the movement the consortium itself created, using our own system against us." Rutledge smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I want to make you an offer." Moses waited. "Stop this now. The breeding program is already finished. We all know that. The consortium is dissolved. You've won. In exchange, I'll grant you and Rachel freedom. Legal, documented freedom. You can go north. Start a life. I'll even provide travel funds." For a long moment, Moses said nothing. Then, "And the others? The 400 people you and your friend still own. I can't free them all. I'd lose everything." "Yes," Moses said softly. "You would." Something in his tone made Rutledge's hand move instinctively toward the pistol he'd placed in his desk drawer before this conversation. But Moses made no threatening movement. He simply stood there, looking at the man who legally owned him, who had watched him grow up, who had worked him like machinery and never once seen him as human. "You think I'm the architect of this?" Moses asked. "You think I could organize something this complex while being watched constantly? While having no resources, no freedom of movement, no legal standing even to speak in court if I were accused? Then who? You created this, Mr. Rutledge. Every bit of it. Your breeding program, your ledgers, your systematic dehumanization. You built the machinery. All that happened was someone learned to operate it." Moses turned toward the door. "As for your offer, I'll consider it. But I don't think you understand yet. This isn't about me winning. This is about you learning." He left before Rutledge could respond, before the situation could escalate. And Rutledge, sitting alone in his study with his unused pistol, felt something he'd never experienced in his own home before: fear. 2 weeks later, Silas Rutledge disappeared from his bedroom. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Yazoo Delta intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Rutledge was found after 6 days, longer than any previous captivity. He was discovered in the old record-keeping building on his own plantation, the same structure where Moses had spent years copying breeding ledgers. When the sheriff and several armed men broke down the door, they found Rutledge chained to a desk, surrounded by stacks upon stacks of documents. These weren't the annotated ledgers the other owners had described. These were something far more comprehensive, a complete documentation of the consortium's breeding program from its inception, copied in meticulous detail. Every forced pairing, every child born from the program, every separation of families, every woman who had miscarried under the stress, every man who had been sold away from his children, every calculated decision made over 20 years of treating human beings as livestock. But what made these documents devastating was the addition Rutledge discovered when he was coherent enough to read them. Next to each entry about an enslaved person, someone had written the corresponding information about Rutledge's own family. Next to the record of an enslaved woman's forced pregnancy, there was a note about Rutledge's wife's pregnancies. Next to the sale of an enslaved child, there was information about where Rutledge's own children went to school. The parallel was inescapable, horrifying. Here is what you did to others, and here is what it would feel like if it were done to you. The sheriff, a man named William Cortland who had known Rutledge for 15 years, later testified in a private deposition that what disturbed him most wasn't Rutledge's physical condition, he was thin, dehydrated, but medically stable, but rather his mental state. Rutledge kept repeating phrases from the ledgers, mixing them with fragments of personal memories. Sarah, age 17, paired with Thomas, age 24. My daughter Elizabeth is 17 now. Productive outcome expected within 9 months. Elizabeth went to her first cotillion in December, *. The documents surrounding Rutledge included something else that would only be fully understood later, detailed schedules showing which enslaved people had been assigned to visit him during his captivity. These schedules mimicked exactly the breeding rotation schedules Rutledge himself had designed. But instead of sexual encounters, the schedules indicated something else. Monday, March 4, 2 p.m., Clara, age 19, product of 1825 pairing between Esther and Samuel. Reading session, Ledger Volume 3, pages 47-52. Clara was Moses Jackson's half-sister, born from one of the forced pairings his mother Esther had endured before her death. Reading those ledger pages to Rutledge meant reading aloud the clinical documentation of her own conception, the reduction of her parents to breeding stock, the calculation of her value based on her mother's previous productive outcomes. When Rutledge was finally able to speak coherently 3 days after being found, he provided testimony to Sheriff Cortland that painted a picture of systematic psychological dismantling. The first day of his captivity, he said, he had been left alone with the documents, forced to read his own handwriting documenting 20 years of human trafficking and forced reproduction. The clinical language he had used, language he had been proud of for its efficiency and clarity, became unbearable when he was forced to read it slowly, carefully, understanding for the first time what each entry actually meant. The second day, the visits began. Young men and women, all born from the consortium's breeding program, came in shifts. They didn't speak to him directly. They simply sat across the desk from him the way he had sat across from buyers when selling their parents or siblings. And they read from the ledgers. They read about their own origins, their family's destruction, their systematic production as if they were crops or livestock. And after each reading, they would simply look at him, their faces carefully neutral, letting him see them as people rather than property. One visitor was a young man named Benjamin, 22 years old, who had been born from a pairing between a woman from Rutledge's plantation and a man from Crenshaw's. Benjamin's mother had died in childbirth with her 4th forced pregnancy. His father had been sold to a Louisiana plantation when Benjamin was 6, to prevent attachment that might make him less compliant. Benjamin read these facts from the ledger in a steady voice, then asked Rutledge a single question: "Can you remember what my mother looked like?" Rutledge couldn't. He remembered her designation in the ledger, productive female, strong constitution, good temperament *, but he couldn't recall her face, her voice, anything that would identify her as a specific human being rather than an asset. This inability haunted him more than anything else during his captivity. The third and fourth days brought more visitors, each with their own ledger entries, each representing a life reduced to data points in Rutledge's meticulous records. A woman named Margaret, who had been separated from her 3 children, sold to different plantations to prevent unproductive emotional attachments. A man named Joshua, who had been bred specifically for physical strength, paired 5 times with different women, his children scattered across 3 states, none of which he'd been allowed to know or raise. By the 5th day, Rutledge was no longer reading the ledgers. He was writing. Someone had left him fresh paper and ink, and he found himself compulsively documenting his own experience, using the same clinical language he had once used for enslaved people. Subject exhibit significant psychological distress. Appetite diminished. Sleep disrupted by recurring thoughts of documented subjects. Recommendation: continued exposure to consequences of systematic dehumanization. This self-documentation, found later among the papers surrounding him, revealed the depth of his psychological collapse. He was applying his own system to himself, trying to process his guilt and horror through the only framework he understood, the reduction of human experience to data and analysis. The 6th day brought the final visitor, a woman in her 60s who introduced herself only as Hannah. She had been enslaved on Rutledge's plantation when he first inherited it in 1823, one of the first women entered into the breeding program. She had borne 6 children over 15 years, each one sold away as soon as they were old enough to be profitable elsewhere. She was freed now. Crenshaw had freed his enslaved people after his own captivity, and she had come to tell Rutledge something he needed to hear. "I don't hate you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "Hate would require me to see you as something worth hating. What you need to understand, Mr. Rutledge, is that for 20 years, you didn't see us. We were here, right in front of you, and you looked through us like we were furniture. Moses didn't create something new with what happened to you and the others. He just made you feel what it's like to be seen the way you saw us, as functions, as tools, as things that exist for someone else's purpose." She placed a final document on the desk before him, a list of names. Every person who had been born from the consortium's breeding program, complete with their current locations, if known, their families, if they had been able to form them, their fates, if they had died. The list was 47 pages long, over 300 names. "These are people," Hannah said. "Every single one. They have favorite foods, and songs that make them cry, and dreams they'll never achieve because you made sure of that. Moses wanted you to know their names. All of them. By memory if possible, but at least by reading them aloud. That was his instruction, that you had to say each name out loud, acknowledging they existed." Rutledge spent his final hours of captivity reading that list aloud, his voice breaking repeatedly, tears falling onto the pages. When the sheriff found him 6 days after his disappearance, Rutledge was on page 39, his voice a hoarse whisper, still reading names into the empty room. The discovery of Rutledge created a crisis among the remaining consortium members and the local authorities. The evidence of what had been done during these captivities, the forced confrontation with their own practices, was now undeniable. But prosecuting anyone for it presented an impossible challenge. What crime had been committed? The owners had been temporarily detained, yes, but they had been fed, sheltered, and physically unharmed. They had been shown documents, their own documents, and had received visits from people who simply read information aloud and asked questions. Moreover, the sophistication required to orchestrate these reversals suggested a level of organization among enslaved people that the white community was unwilling to acknowledge publicly. To prosecute would mean admitting that enslaved people were capable of complex planning, of maintaining absolute secrecy across multiple plantations, of outwitting their masters so completely that no evidence of conspiracy could be found. Such an admission would undermine the entire philosophical foundation of slavery. Thaddeus Beaumont disappeared 5 days after Rutledge was found. His captivity lasted only 4 days, but those 4 days were reportedly the most intense of all the reversals. Beaumont had been the consortium member most enthusiastic about what he called the scientific approach to breeding. He had pushed for more detailed record-keeping, more systematic pairing based on physical and mental characteristics, more aggressive separation of families to prevent emotional complications. When Beaumont was found chained in an abandoned tobacco barn on the edge of his own property, he was surrounded not by documents, but by tools, the whips, chains, and branding irons used to maintain discipline on the plantations. These tools hadn't been used on him. They were simply arranged around him, along with ledgers documenting every punishment inflicted on enslaved people across the 9 plantations over 2 decades. The implication was clear: here are the instruments of control you relied upon. And here is the documentation of how you used them. Beaumont's visitors during his captivity had included people who bore the scars of those instruments. They showed him healed whip marks, brands that identified them as property, missing fingers from accidents that were really punishments. They didn't accuse him or curse him. They simply showed him what the system had cost in human flesh, and asked him to calculate whether the profits had been worth it. The question broke him. Beaumont had always justified the consortium's practices through economic arguments. Slavery was necessary for regional prosperity, the breeding program was essential for maintaining labor forces, discipline was required for efficiency. But when forced to look at the actual human cost, itemized and displayed before him, his economic justifications crumbled. He could calculate profit margins and crop yields with extraordinary precision. But he had never learned to calculate the value of a person's dignity, a child's need for their parent, a woman's autonomy over her own body. After his release, Beaumont began the process of freeing his enslaved people, though he did so more strategically than Rutledge. He sold portions of his land to finance their transition to freedom, negotiated work contracts that gave them equity in the plantation's production, and established a fund to help relocated families reconnect with members who had been sold away. His transformation was slower than Rutledge's dramatic collapse, but ultimately more practical. By 1847, everyone who had been enslaved on his plantation was legally free, and several had become landowners themselves through Beaumont-sponsored purchases. The aftermath of the reversal spread like ripples across the Yazoo Delta and beyond. The immediate impact was the complete dissolution of the consortium. By the summer of 1844, the quarterly meetings had stopped, the breeding program was formally ended, and the careful coordination between the 9 plantations had fractured into isolated, increasingly desperate attempts to maintain profitability without the systematic exploitation that had sustained them. But the deeper consequences took years to fully manifest. The 9 owners, each transformed by their experience, responded in dramatically different ways that collectively reshaped the region's approach to slavery. Some responses were admirable, others merely pragmatic, but none could return to the casual brutality that had characterized the consortium's operations. Bartholomew Crenshaw, the first to be taken, never recovered his psychological equilibrium. His wife Mary wrote in her private journal, discovered decades later among family papers, that her husband would wake most nights in a cold sweat, muttering about schedules and rotations. He became obsessed with tracking down the children born from his plantation's breeding program, spending considerable sums to purchase their freedom from wherever they had been sold. By the time of his death in 1851, he had freed or purchased the freedom of 63 people directly connected to his former breeding operations. His fellow slaveholders considered him mad. His freed beneficiaries considered him desperate for a redemption he could never actually achieve. Josiah Pryor took a different path. His experience during captivity, being forced to read documentation of families he had deliberately separated, led him to become an advocate for what he called ameliorated slavery, a gradual system of reform that would eventually phase out the institution entirely. He wrote letters to newspapers, spoke at civic meetings, and proposed legislation that would have limited the separation of families and required formal education for enslaved children. His ideas were too radical for Mississippi in the 1840s, and he was eventually forced to move to Maryland, where more moderate reform movements were gaining traction. His advocacy achieved little tangible success, but his writings became sources for later abolitionists who could point to a former slave owner acknowledging the system's fundamental cruelty. Nathaniel Pendergast responded with denial and deflection. He freed a token number of enslaved people, enough to claim he had been moved by conscience, but maintained his labor force through increasingly elaborate legal arrangements that were slavery in all but name. He rented enslaved people from other owners, paid minimal wages while charging inflated prices for food and shelter provided on his plantation, and created debt arrangements that trapped nominally free black workers in permanent servitude. He died in 1859, still wealthy, still convinced he had done nothing truly wrong, his response to the reversals being merely cosmetic changes to avoid further psychological torture. Cyrus Whitfield abandoned plantation ownership entirely. Within months of his captivity, he sold his land and enslaved people, profiting one final time from human trafficking, and moved to New Orleans, where he invested in shipping and banking. He never spoke publicly about what happened to him during those days of captivity, but his business papers reveal an obsessive avoidance of any venture connected to plantation agriculture. He became wealthy again through entirely different means, perhaps believing that distance and different industries could absolve him of his past. His former enslaved people, sold in bulk to a Louisiana plantation owner notorious for brutality, likely viewed his escape as one final betrayal. Augustus Fairchild, the man who had first proposed dissolving the consortium, struggled with practical implementation of his moral awakening. He wanted to free his enslaved people, but genuinely feared the financial ruin it would bring to his family. His solution was a gradual emancipation plan that freed people in cohorts over 5 years, with freed individuals receiving small plots of land carved from his property. By 1849, everyone was legally free, though many remained on his reduced plantation as paid laborers, the economic realities of the antebellum South offering few better options. Fairchild died in 1856, still paying off debts from his gradual emancipation, his obituary noting him as both a man of conscience and a cautionary tale of impractical philanthropy. Cornelius Vance's response was perhaps the most coldly calculated. He freed his enslaved people in 1844, but structured their freedom with contracts that essentially indentured them to his plantation for 7 years in exchange for wages paid at the contract's conclusion. Most of his former enslaved people, having no resources and facing legal restrictions on their movement as free black people in Mississippi, had no choice but to accept. Vance maintained his plantation's productivity while technically complying with his moral obligation, demonstrating how the language of freedom could be manipulated to preserve exploitation. When the 7-year contract expired in 1851, many of the freed people discovered the promised wages had been consumed by calculated debts for housing and food. Vance considered this good business. His former slaves considered it proof that legal freedom meant little without economic power. Edmund Halsey took the most extreme position. After his captivity, he became a fervent convert to immediate abolitionism, freeing all his enslaved people without conditions and dedicating his remaining resources to supporting their relocation to free states. He sold his plantation for a fraction of its value to fund transportation and settlement costs for over 90 people. By 1846, he was bankrupt and living in a modest house in Vicksburg, working as a clerk, the kind of job usually reserved for men without property or prospects. His former peers shunned him. His family was humiliated by their reduced circumstances. But letters from the people he had freed, sent from Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, expressed a gratitude that seemed to sustain him. He died in 1862, poor but apparently at peace, one of the very few former slave owners who chose complete rather than convenient redemption. Silas Rutledge's response was the most dramatic and, in its way, the most devastating to his former standing. His immediate freeing of all enslaved people on his plantation in March 1844 shocked the region. His subsequent actions, using his remaining resources to trace and purchase the freedom of people who had been sold away from his plantation over the years, bankrupted him completely. His wife, unable to accept the social and financial catastrophe, left him and returned to her family in Charleston with their children. But Rutledge went further. In 1845, he began testifying in legal proceedings, as a witness in cases involving enslaved people, as an expert in cases about plantation practices, as a reluctant source for abolitionists gathering evidence about the slave system's operations. His testimony was devastating precisely because he held nothing back, describing in clinical detail the mechanisms of the breeding program, the deliberate separation of families, the calculated dehumanization required to maintain the system. These testimonies made him a pariah. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. He received threatening letters. Someone burned down the small house he had moved to after selling his plantation. But Rutledge seemed driven by something beyond concern for social standing or personal safety, a need to document and expose what he had spent 20 years building, as if public confession might achieve what private guilt could not. In 1847, Rutledge published a remarkable document, a full accounting of his plantation's breeding program from 1823 to 1844, including financial calculations showing the profits generated from forced reproduction. He published it not to boast, but to condemn, meticulously demonstrating that his wealth, the wealth that had made him respectable and influential, had been built directly on systematic rape and family destruction. The document was seized and burned by Mississippi authorities, deemed inflammatory and dangerous to public order. But copies had already been sent north, where abolitionists distributed it widely as evidence of slavery's inherent brutality. Thaddeus Beaumont's more measured approach achieved different results. His systematic transition of his enslaved people to freedom, combined with his financial support for family reunification, created a model that some moderate reformers pointed to as evidence that emancipation could be gradual and managed. Beaumont himself never advocated for abolition beyond his own plantation, but his example, however limited, and however motivated by personal guilt rather than political principle, demonstrated that ending the breeding program and freeing enslaved people didn't inevitably lead to economic collapse. The 9 plantations, once the most profitable in the region, experienced varied fates. Some were sold and subdivided. Others struggled on with greatly reduced labor forces. A few found new owners who, unaware of or unconcerned with the consortium's history, attempted to restore traditional plantation operations. But the breeding program itself never recovered in the Yazoo Delta. Other plantation owners, hearing whispered accounts of what had happened to the consortium members, became more cautious, less systematic, more aware that their enslaved people might be watching and remembering and planning. This diffusion of fear, the recognition that enslaved people were not passive property, but potential agents of sophisticated resistance, may have been Moses Jackson's most significant long-term achievement. He had demonstrated that the system's weaknesses were exploitable, that intelligence and patience could accomplish what violence could not, that those who were systematically dehumanized could prove themselves more strategically sophisticated than their oppressors. Moses Jackson himself remained at what had been Rutledge's plantation through the summer of 1844, a curious position, given that he had been freed. He organized the transition, helping the newly freed people navigate the complicated legal and economic realities of freedom in a slave state. He negotiated work contracts with nearby landowners who still needed labor. He established a school in one of the former slave cabins, teaching literacy and basic mathematics to children and adults who had been deliberately kept ignorant. He created networks to help people locate family members who had been sold away, using his knowledge of the consortium's records to trace where people had been sent. This organizing work was perhaps more remarkable than the reversals themselves. Moses could have left immediately after gaining freedom, fled north to safety like thousands of others escaping slavery. Instead, he stayed for months in the very region where he could be re-enslaved if legal technicalities were challenged, where his life was certainly in danger from those who suspected his role in the consortium's collapse. He stayed because the reversals had never been about personal revenge. They had been about creating space for something new. And that required more than just breaking the old system. Rachel worked beside him during these months, organizing the women who had suffered most directly from the breeding program, helping them understand that freedom meant reclaiming authority over their own bodies, their own reproductive choices. She taught them about herbal contraceptives and abortions that could give them control plantation owners had denied. She helped arrange marriages, real marriages, with legal standing where possible, or at least ceremonies with community recognition, between people who wanted to formalize relationships that slavery had rendered meaningless. Together, Moses and Rachel created what might be understood as a template for Reconstruction before Reconstruction existed, a systematic attempt to help people transition from being property to being free, addressing not just legal status, but the practical, psychological, and economic challenges that freedom entailed. They weren't entirely successful. The obstacles were too great, the resources too limited, the hostility of the surrounding white community too intense. But they tried. And some of what they built lasted. In July of 1844, Moses and Rachel finally left Mississippi. The historical record shows they reached Ohio by late August, settling in a community near Cincinnati that had been established by free black people and formerly enslaved people who had escaped or purchased their freedom. The community had infrastructure designed to help newcomers integrate, churches that provided material support, schools for children and adults, craftspeople who would train apprentices, and a shared understanding that freedom in the North was precarious and required collective mutual aid to maintain. Moses found work as a clerk at a black-owned shipping company. His education and meticulous penmanship finally serving purposes that built rather than documented oppression. Rachel worked as a seamstress and eventually opened a small shop. They purchased a modest house in 1847, actual property ownership, a thing that had been literally impossible for them in Mississippi. They had 4 children, Esther, named for Moses's mother, Frederick, Hannah, and James. Census records show all 4 children attended school, several through secondary education, an achievement that would have been punishable by law in the state where their parents had been enslaved. Moses lived until 1879, dying at age 56 from pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. His obituary in the Cincinnati Colored Citizen was brief and carefully worded, a respected member of the community and devoted family man, survived by his wife Rachel, 4 children, and 12 grandchildren. Services at Bethel Church. There was no mention of Mississippi, no reference to what he had done there, no acknowledgement of the systematic reversal that had broken a breeding program and changed 9 men's lives. The silence was likely intentional. Even in the North, even after the Civil War, speaking openly about slave resistance could bring unwanted attention to families who wanted simply to live in peace. But within the black community in Cincinnati and beyond, Moses Jackson's story persisted. It was told in fragments, often disguised as fiction or attributed to unnamed sources, passed along in churches and social gatherings and whispered conversations between people who understood what it meant to have someone like them prove capable of strategic resistance on that scale. The story changed in the telling, accumulated embellishments, sometimes merged with other tales of resistance. But the core remained: a slave had used intelligence, patience, and the master's own systems to make them feel what they had inflicted on others. The impact rippled through generations in unexpected ways. Some of the children born from the consortium's breeding program, freed by Crenshaw or Rutledge or Beaumont, eventually moved north themselves. A few ended up in Cincinnati, where they met Moses and Rachel, creating a small community of people bound by shared history and trauma. These connections formed networks of mutual support that lasted decades, families helping each other in ways plantation ownership had deliberately prevented. One of these connections involved Moses's half-sister, Clara, who had read her own ledger entries to Rutledge during his captivity. Clara had been freed by Crenshaw and moved to Cincinnati in 1846, where Moses helped her find work and housing. She eventually married a carpenter named Isaiah Foster, and they had 3 children. One of those children, a daughter named Margaret, became a teacher, educating formerly enslaved children through the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction. Margaret Foster's diaries, preserved by her descendants, include a brief mention of her uncle Moses, a quiet man who carried great weight behind his eyes, who taught us that intelligence could be a weapon sharper than any blade. Back in Mississippi, the consortium's collapse had lasting effects that extended beyond the 9 plantations. The breeding program's systematic approach had been unusual even among slaveholders, but its existence had normalized certain practices: detailed record keeping, clinical language about human reproduction, coordinated breeding schedules between plantations. After the reversals, these practices became less common, or at least less openly discussed. Plantation owners became more cautious, more aware that documentation could be used against them, more conscious that enslaved people were paying attention in ways they had previously dismissed as impossible. This shift, minor as it might seem, represented a crack in the psychological foundation of slavery. The system had always depended on the fiction that enslaved people were content with their condition, that they lacked the capacity for complex thought or planning, that they accepted their status as natural and inevitable. Moses Jackson and those who worked with him had shattered that fiction so completely that even slaveholders who wanted to believe it found themselves hesitating, second-guessing, looking over their shoulders. The broader historical impact remains difficult to quantify. The reversals weren't a slave rebellion that sparked immediate emancipation or inspired widespread uprisings. They affected 9 men and their immediate circle, a tiny fraction of the slave-owning population. But the story spread through underground networks, reaching enslaved people across the South, who drew hope and strategic lessons from it. It demonstrated that resistance didn't require violence or martyrdom, that intelligence and patience could achieve systematic change, that the master's own tools could be turned against them. Some historians have argued that the Mississippi reversals influenced later resistance strategies, the way enslaved people used literacy as a weapon, the careful documentation that made their oppressors confront their own actions, the psychological rather than physical nature of the confrontation. These elements appeared in other contexts as the antebellum period progressed. Whether Moses Jackson directly inspired these later actions, or whether he tapped into strategies that were already emerging across the enslaved community, remains unclear. What's certain is that he proved such strategies could work, could actually break parts of the system rather than just helping individuals escape it. The antebellum period and Civil War eventually overtook these individual stories of resistance. When Union forces moved through Mississippi in 1863, some of the former consortium plantations were occupied and their lands distributed to formerly enslaved people, though most of these redistributions were later reversed during Reconstruction's betrayal. The records of the breeding program, already fragmentary and deliberately obscured, became even more scattered during the war's chaos. Some were destroyed deliberately by families ashamed of their documented participation in such practices. Others were lost in fires or simply misplaced in the general upheaval. But some records survived. They surfaced decades later in attics and estate sales, in historical society donations and academic archives. Researchers piecing together the history of slavery in Mississippi found fragments, ledgers with clinical breeding records, personal letters mentioning the mysterious disappearances, testimony from legal proceedings where consortium members had been forced to describe their practices. These fragments, assembled slowly over the 20th century, confirmed the essential truth of stories that had been passed down through black families but dismissed by white historians as exaggeration or fabrication. One particularly revealing discovery came in 1934, when a researcher found Silas Rutledge's personal diary in the papers of his estranged wife's family. The diary, kept sporadically between 1844 and his death in 1852, revealed his ongoing psychological torment. Entries described nightmares where he was chained to his desk while names from his ledgers were read aloud endlessly. He wrote about seeing faces of people he had once owned, wondering if they had been real or if his memory was creating them now in guilt. He questioned everything he had once believed about racial hierarchy, about the naturalness of slavery, about his own moral standing. The final entry, dated March 12, 1852, 2 weeks before his death from what was recorded as heart failure, read simply, "I understand now why Hannah said she didn't hate me. Hatred would require her to see me as fully human. I made myself into something less than that, a function, a mechanism, a thing that processed other people into property. Moses didn't need to destroy me. I had already reduced myself to machinery. He simply held up a mirror so I could finally see what I had become." This admission, that the punishment had been making him see himself clearly, captured the essence of what Moses Jackson had orchestrated. Not revenge in the conventional sense, but revelation. Not violence, but visibility. Not destruction, but recognition. This mystery shows us that sometimes the darkest chapters of history aren't about supernatural horrors, but about humans confronting the systems they created and the humanity they denied. The story of Moses Jackson asks us to consider what justice means when the law itself is unjust, what resistance looks like when violence would be suicide, and whether making oppressors feel their victims' experiences can ever constitute adequate accountability. What do you think of this story? Could you imagine maintaining that level of patience and planning under those conditions? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in those Mississippi plantations? Names of collaborators, details of the network, methods that were never documented? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that make you question everything you thought you knew about history. See you in the next video.